In this section of the videos, chapters 18 through 29, we're going to look continually at some of the sign acts of Jeremiah, as well as 29 will prepare us for what we'll see in the next major section of the book, in particular chapters 30 through 33, which is the presentation of the new covenant. Returning our attention to Jeremiah chapter 18, here we have the third of the sign acts, and this relates to the potter and the ruined pot. Verses 1 through 23 relate something of the journey that he makes and the observation of the potter at work on the potter's wheel. So he has traveled to the potter's house, and he has noticed that as the potter is working, there is some type of deformation that occurs within the clay. In other words, there's a flaw that is developing. So the potter then takes that same clay and then begins to reshape it, to remake it into another pot as he desires. And the point, of course, in fact, is that Judah is like the original pot, which did not yield to God's hands. Thus God would make another pot. Verses 13 and following give us an indication of the oracle of the judgment of the Lord against Judah. Their land will be a horror. They will be scattered, and the Lord will show them his back, not his face. This is an indication that he will allow their sins to bring consequences as he withdraws their protection. So he in some ways turns his face away from them, his favor away from them, and as a result they're going to suffer the consequences of their actions. This is the judgment upon Judah that will occur. Continuing in this same passage in 18 through 23, we have the further revelation of the plot against Jeremiah, whereby those individuals intend to denounce him. And there are times, as you will see, where they ultimately would like to take his life. Verses 19 through 23, Jeremiah turns his attention to the Lord and brings his own case to the Lord in pleading for the Lord to respond and to act. Verses 21 through 23 are in many ways invectives against those who are seeking to denounce and to, in many ways, take the life of Jeremiah. And so he gives a detailed list of those here that would you hand their children over to famine? Would you give them over to the power of the sword? Let their wives become childless and widowed. Let their young men be struck down by the sword. Do not wipe out their iniquity. Let them be forced to stumble. All these are somewhat like invectives, which will lead us, in fact, to a later understanding in chapter 19 of the execration text. In 19, we have the potter's pot that is now broken. Longman, in his commentary, does not necessarily draw a direct movement sequentially, chronologically, from chapter 18 to 19, or of the incidents that occur in 19 as a natural extension from the previous chapter. However, I think that it seems quite intentional that 18 leads into 19. I do believe that there's a correlation. And in fact, in the sermon that I've uploaded for you to view as a part of the discussion for this section, I think you'll be able to discern that I have drawn the connection between these chapters because it does seem somewhat logical to me. In this story, the prophet has been encouraged to go, has been required to go to the valley of Ben Hinnom. And don't forget the earlier comments about this place name, the Valley of Hinnom. This is where there was child sacrifice, and this is also the place where the bodies would be heaped up after the devastation and destruction of Jerusalem. In this case, he is to take elders with him for a demonstration. And the place is indicative of this eventual result of judgment. Remember again, child sacrifice, etc. There's an overtone here of the oracle related to the execration text from Egypt, where the enemies' names are to be written on pottery or potsherds, potter shards, and then smashed as a way of symbolizing the destruction of their enemies. And this was a common occurrence in Egypt, where they would take these potsherds, they would write out the names of their enemies, they would throw those against the wall and break them, and the indication was kind of a magical incantation of sorts in that so would this be what would happen to their enemies. They would be shattered and destroyed. Well, here in the Valley of Ben Hinnom, with the elders surrounding him, Jeremiah is to shatter the pot that he has obtained from the potter, again, possibly as an extension of chapter 18 into chapter 19. So he is to shatter this pot. They would understand the symbolism. They would draw the connection with the execration text, and they would understand that this is a pronouncement against them. Verse 14 indicates that Jeremiah returned from Topheth. And again, look back in the earlier sections as we've talked about this, where presumably he did the very thing required in the oracle, which was to shatter the pots. And he then was to stand in the courtyard of the temple and prophesy about the destruction. And this is exactly what he then did. There's a real powerful symbol in judgment against the nation that is provided with the shattering of the pot, and then also going to the temple, the courtyard of the temple, to prophesy about this. And you'll notice in the sermon that I've uploaded that at the end of the sermon, the last act that I take there will be illustrative of this type of sign act. And I hope that you've already viewed that particular sermon upload. If not, that's a part of your requirements for this section. In chapter 20, we find an example of where Jeremiah does indeed suffer at the hands of his own people, whether those are the people from Anatot or as described here by Pashur. So Pashur was the overseer of the temple, had significant influence, and he heard the things that Jeremiah had done and had prophesied, and as a result, he had Jeremiah beaten and placed in stocks. We're going to find this referenced again when we come over to the later chapters, such as the letter to the exiles, and we'll see that in chapter 29. Jeremiah, however, is released the next day, and he calls out Pashur and renames him. And this act of renaming was not an act of respect. In fact, often when the prophets would name or rename someone, it was typically as a part of a judgment oracle, and that's exactly what we find here. That the person, Pashur, is going to be renamed, and the naming is something that we'll see as a theme throughout the book, as found in 625 and all the way down to 49:29. His name now becomes terror on every side. Well, this is not a good thing, and Pashur, of course, is probably going to understand exactly what Jeremiah is doing, and in all likelihood, he will understand that this catchphrase, terror on every side, is an indictment against the falseness of what he has believed that would come to bear with Jerusalem. So Jeremiah then predicts that Pashur will go into captivity and will die there, him and his friends, that should be plural, him and his friends who have prophesied falsely to the nation of Judah. I'll correct and add to the PowerPoint before I upload it in just a little bit. So then we have, I've listed for you here in 625, 23, 2010, 46:5, and 49:29 the examples where the terror, in fact, will surround them. And 23, of course, is where. So this phrase, this catchphrase, is a unique device of remembrance in which the people will acknowledge that what Jeremiah has said has come true. This will be a poignant remembrance of the words of Jeremiah. In verses 14 through 18, we have another lament of Jeremiah. And remember, he's disconsolate. He has a lack of console over the fact that he's been preaching and the things have not occurred as he has preached thus far. And we'll see in a few moments that this is going to be about 23 years or so that he is preaching this message. And ultimately, of course, it happens. But in the interim, Jeremiah is suffering. He is struggling. He is inconsolable that the things that he has preached and now suffering for have not taken place. And so with this lament in chapter 20, he says, "May the day I was born be cursed. May the man who brought the news of my birth, may that person be cursed. May he be accursed for allowing me to even be born." That literally, in many ways, what he's saying is that that person should have found a way to not allow him to have been born. Why did I come out of the womb only to see struggle and sorrow? This lament reveals the extreme distress that Jeremiah is experiencing over his preaching, but not seeing the imminent and tangible results that were expected. In 21, we now return to something of a historical narrative, an interlude that takes place here. where Zedekiah now sends to Jeremiah with a request, and the request is somewhat denied. In verses 1 through 7, Zedekiah has sent Pashur, and the commentators believe that this is not the same one as in chapter 20, to ask about Nebuchadnezzar's response to the rebellion against him. So this is very, very likely set at the end of Zedekiah's reign, where Nebuchadnezzar has likely sieged Jerusalem again. Remember, there are 3 deportations. There are 3 evidences where Nebuchadnezzar has come against Jerusalem. The first is in 605, then 597, 96, and then in 588 through 86. We typically say 587. So verse 2 indicates that it's already occurring. So the siege is underway, and Zedekiah is now seeking direction from the Lord rather than his own advisors. And my comment about this is it's too little too late. So Jeremiah is going to give basically 3 messages, and you can read the context of 3 through 7, 8 through 10, and then 11 through 14, and you can discern how these 3 messages are somewhat laid out. In the first of the 3, the Lord sets himself against Zedekiah and Judah. He even says, I myself will fight against you. Destruction is going to come. Zedekiah and the leaders will be handed over to Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. And just to refresh the story in your minds, Zedekiah, at the very end of the siege, realizes that they cannot hold out any longer. And so in somewhat of a cowardly fashion, Zedekiah exits with some of his family and or other leaders out the garden gate, and he flees down toward the Jordan River. He makes it to around Jericho, where he is captured by the Babylonians, and they take him up to Damascus. If I remember correctly, it's Damascus, where he is then confronted by Nebuchadnezzar, who kills all of his sons in front of him and then puts out his own eyes. He is then taken to Babylon, imprisoned, and eventually dies. So this word of relief that Zedekiah is going to hope for from Jeremiah is not going to, in fact, take place. The Lord himself will fight against Zedekiah. The second movement, the second part of the oracle, the second message, basically says whoever stays in this city will die. He says here secondarily, I have set myself against this city. And then the third is to the house of the king of Judah. And the Lord has set himself against the haughty who claim, who can be against us? And their thought is, well, we are the royals. We are in Jerusalem. No one can really set themselves against us. But in fact, the prophecy is that they will be punished. In chapter 22, we now have an oracle that is directed toward the kings of Judah, somewhat continued perhaps from chapter 21 thematically, but it's likely set before the events of chapter 21. Or at least it's an oracle that encapsulates the failure of the royal line to accomplish, as I say here, God's will with faithfulness to the covenant. Verses 1 through 8 provide a general introduction accusing the kings of failure. They failed to administer justice. They failed to be just in their reign. They remained, their failure to remain obedient. And as a result, this is going to result in their house. And when this word house is used, we're talking about the dynasty of the king. This is not just simply talking about the physical abode or residence of the king, but we're talking about the dynasty. And as later generations will come and they will see that there is no king on the throne as it will be, though eventually there will be, the people will ask what has happened. And the answer is that they have abandoned the covenant, and as a result, they in fact are to be punished. 3 kings are mentioned in this chapter. The first is Shallum. This is the son of Josiah. Now, you may not recognize the name Shallum, but you do Jehoahaz. And Jehoahaz is a short-term king, only about 3 months. He is the son of Josiah. He was placed on the throne in 609 after Josiah died on the plains of Megiddo. Remember, Josiah died there, was brought back to Jerusalem, and was his son then was placed on the throne in his stead. However, the Egyptians who defeated Josiah on the plains of Megiddo, they came back through Jerusalem, and in fact deposed Jehoahaz and placed on the throne Jehoiakim, who also was known as Eliakim, but in this case referred to as Jehoiakim, and that's the more prominent name that you will see. So Jehoiakim reigned from about 609 down to 598, 597, the latter part of 597. And Jehoiakim initiated significant buildings, construction, but he was not faithful to the covenant, and so the indictment here is that their house and all that he had done would cease to be. The dynasty of the king would cease to be, but the work of this king would cease to be. And it is significantly speculated that Jehoiakim was likely assassinated. The third is Coniah, who is also called Jehoiakim, and he reigned for about 3 months after the death of his father Jehoiakim, and he was deported to Babylon in 597. He was in prison for 37 years, though he was released from prison toward the end of that time, and it appears that he was not treated poorly while he was imprisoned. There are indications, records from the annals of Babylon that indicate that there were food portions that were given to some of the prisoners, and even to an individual, if I remember correctly, whose name is identified as Jehoiakim. Chapter 23, we turn our attention to the false shepherds and the false prophets, and that is kind of a theme that goes throughout all of the chapter, though there are some little bit of interludes, for instance, in verses 5 through 8, where we have a reminder about the Davidic promise. But the whole of the chapter really indicates and posits the role of the false shepherds and the false prophets, and in fact what will occur to them. Verses 1 through 6 reveal the shepherds who had led the people astray will be replaced by those who will be faithful when the Lord regathers his people, and that's going to of course come at the end of the exile. Verses 5 through 8, the reminder of the Davidic promise, a little bit of some messianic overtones here. Verses 9 through 32 present the reality of the false prophets and how much it has grieved the Lord. And he is going to deal with them with wormwood and poison. And this, in essence, is a way of acknowledging that they will cease to live. They will not continue on with their abilities because of the Lord's judgment upon them. There's an admonition to the people to not listen to the false prophets' words about peace. The Lord has not sent these prophets, and though they have claimed in dreams, they do not have the word of the Lord. The Lord is against these prophets and their false dreams and their false words. Verses 33 through 40 indicate something of a significant irony that, as I was reading through this and thinking about how this interplay occurs, there's a little bit of a irony in that the burden of the Lord is often the burden upon the prophet to speak the word of the prophet, the word of the Lord to the people. And the Nahum, the oracle of the Lord, sometimes is referred to as Masah, the burden that is placed upon the prophet to preach this word. So the burden of the Lord, in fact, in this case, the burden that the Lord bears is the rebellion and rebellious people of Judah. And ironically, the question is asked from the people concerning the burden of the Lord. And interestingly enough, the people themselves are the burden. But even as the people are inquiring, God becomes silent, as though he forgets his people. And each man's word itself becomes a burden. There's a lot of interplay there, and it's worth reading and thinking through chapter 23 more at length. In chapter 24, we have the good and the bad figs. And here what we see is that this is the time after Jehoiakim. He has been deported by Nebuchadnezzar, and these texts refer to the officials, the craftsmen, the metalsmiths, etc. So we're talking about 597 in the second of the deportations. And the question for so many of the people is what will become of the nation of Judah. And ultimately, as we'll see, God refers to Israel 49 times in the book of Jeremiah because he's really thinking forward about the reconstitution of the people of God who are not just Judah, but you may remember in earlier passages there's a reference to Israel, the northern kingdom, being brought back in as a part of this restoration process. So the vision of the fig baskets is given to Jeremiah. And the question is, where's the hope for the future? Is it on the people who remain in Jerusalem, which is what they thought, or is it upon the people who are in exile? And the irony here is that the hope for Judah is not upon those who remain as the remnant there in Jerusalem, but the hope for Israel, the hope for Judah, is with those who are in exile. So the two analogies, the good figs, are the exiles who the Lord will watch over. He will build them up. There's that restorative language that is both judgment that he will tear down, but he will build up, and he will give them a heart to know him. And the bad figs, as they are inedible, represent Zedekiah and the remnant in Jerusalem, that in fact the sword and the famine will come against them. And so Zedekiah, of course, his reign is going to end in 587, 586. And in that time, Zedekiah, of course, meets his end. The city of Jerusalem is virtually razed. It is destroyed to the ground. And this ends this first temple period. The Temple Mount, that whole area is laid low. And it is only in the 521 to 516, 15, when the temple is finished, that then the rebuilding of the temple is finished, that we have the initiation of the second temple period. So the good figs are the exiles, the bad figs are those who are still resident under Zedekiah in Jerusalem. The hope for the future is really in the exiles who will return and be restored, not in the people who remain in Jerusalem. And then in chapter 25, the exile as detailed is kind of laid out for us here. And just very quickly, I'll run through some of the important highlights of this chapter as we kind of move toward the end of our presentation. Verses 1 through 14 set once again the context. It's the fourth year of Jehoiakim. This is going to be 605. It's also listed as the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, and we know historically that that is in fact exactly the case. Nebuchadnezzar has died, and Nebuchadnezzar, his son, is going to take over, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to reign for many, many years and will raise Babylon to its height and to its zenith. Jeremiah reminds the people in this chapter that he, in fact, has been preaching this word for 23 years. He's warned them, but they have not obeyed. And as a result of that, the Lord is going to use, and this is the quote, my servant Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 9, to come against Judah and the surrounding lands. And the people, in fact, will serve the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, he doesn't live the whole 70 years, but they will serve Nebuchadnezzar and then his successors for a period of 70 years. When that 70 years has been completed, the Lord will deal with and punish Babylon. And in fact, that's exactly what happens as Cyrus, who is the leader of the Persians, overtakes Babylon itself. And we'll maybe talk a little bit about Cyrus and Darius at another time, but there's a lot of historical intrigue as to who Darius the Mede is. But Cyrus is the one who is the king of Persia, and he then does capture Babylon. Babylon falls, and as a result, the people are allowed to begin the process of returning to Judah. Verses 15 through 29, the Lord commands Jeremiah to take the cup of the wine of wrath and make the nations drink from it. And the nations are listed. Jerusalem and Judah, of course, are included in this, but you have Egypt, Uz, the Philistines, etc., and all of these will experience disaster. 30 through 38, the Lord roars and will bring destruction on the whole earth. He will scatter the wicked. None, in fact, will be able to escape. Then we come in Jeremiah 26 to the second of the temple speeches. And this chapter actually is going to move into 27, so that I believe there's a significant tie-in between 26 and the chapters that follow. But in 26 in particular, we have the temple speech as it's laid out and the interplay that's occurring here. Verses 1 through 6, the context is once again set at the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim. This is going to be in 609. Jeremiah is to stand in the courtyard of the temple and deliver the message that though the people have trusted in the temple, the fact that the temple there is there, they should not forget Shiloh. And you will remember, of course, I talked at length about Shiloh earlier in our presentation. 7 through 11, the people, including the priests and the false prophets, are going to be they seized Jeremiah and they claim that he should die. 12 through 15, Jeremiah reminds them that the Lord has sent him to preach his words, so now they should correct their way. Jeremiah actually threatens the people by saying, "If you put me to death, there will be innocent blood upon yourselves, and you will suffer as a result of it." In 16 through 19, the people debate among themselves. They remembered Micah, also preached in the line of Hezekiah about the fall of Zion. But during Hezekiah's time when Micah was preaching, the king nor the people put him to death. They also then remember, though, in 20 through 24, the example of Uriah, who prophesied against the city and who then fled to Egypt. But he was brought back from Egypt and he was killed. So the passage ends by noting that Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, supported Jeremiah. So at this point, Jeremiah was not killed by the people. Obviously, we know that that's the case, but he was delivered from their hands and not handed over to them. So this is what happens in chapter 26. He's standing in the courtyard delivering the second of the temple sermons. And then we move into 27. It appears then that we have the fifth of the sign acts, but this is also in the context of the prophecy related to the temple. And there's a lot going on here, but the context does move this into the reign of Zedekiah. The end of Jehoiakim, Zedekiah now is taken over. Jeremiah was to take chains and a yoke and wear them as a symbol of the servitude that the other nations would also come under. That's Edom, Moab, Ammonites, Tyre, and Sidon. And then in 12 through 22, this same symbol is now applied to Judah. And the admonition is to not listen to the false prophets who claim that Judah will not fall to Babylon. So this is some of the tie-in that we see again from 26, the temple sermon, where Jeremiah is contrasted with the true prophets versus false prophets. And Jeremiah counsels them to serve Babylon and thus live. The Lord will bring his people back from Babylon. And that's the word that Jeremiah brings, contrasted with the word that, in fact, the false prophets would bring. So Jeremiah has consistently preached that Babylon will conquer Jerusalem. Jerusalem should, in fact, just surrender to Babylon, and then ultimately will live and live well under Babylon, in Babylon itself. One of the questions that comes up that relates to the message here, and very interestingly somewhat in verse 19 and eventually in 22, is the articles of the temple are mentioned. So Jeremiah relates, and the interplay here between the false prophets and Jeremiah is the false prophets say that the articles will remain intact, that the temple will remain intact, that there will be nothing that will happen to the temple and the articles, they will not be taken away. But Jeremiah says, no. Let me tell you the truth of this matter. The articles will be taken away. And in this list of articles, there's a kind of a litany of things that will be taken. But one of the things that is not mentioned is the Ark of the Covenant. Then Jeremiah says in verse 22 that eventually these articles will be returned. And the question is, why is the Ark of the Covenant not mentioned here? It is quite uncertain by this time what has actually happened to the Ark of the Covenant. There are some who claim that the Ark of the Covenant was actually removed from Jerusalem during the time of Manasseh, who was the king after Hezekiah, and was sequestered and was hidden so that it could not be taken when and if the city of Jerusalem ever fell. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is found in 2 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. And in that passage, you can look it up easily, notes that Jeremiah, so this would have been at the time that Jeremiah was preaching, perhaps immediately preceding one of the sieges. Somehow in that time frame, Jeremiah took the ark out from Jerusalem and took it to Mount Nebo, which is where Moses ascended to look over into the land of Canaan before the Israelites took the land of Canaan. And in a cave there on Mount Nebo, the ark was sealed, perhaps sealed by the hand of the Lord himself. And there are those in that little passage in 2 Maccabees who were attempting to follow, to mark the way in which the Jeremiah went so they could perhaps later retrieve the ark. But Jeremiah says, no, you shall not find it. You shall not in any way know where this is. Only the Lord and only Jeremiah, of course, will know what it is. And so there's that possibility that, in fact, Jeremiah took it into the desert and the Lord sealed it up to be not found. There are those who even today believe that it was sealed up in a cave, either in Jerusalem or in the environs very, very close to Jerusalem. But the important fact of what I'm highlighting here is that the articles as described in verses 19 and following do not include the Ark of the Covenant. And in all of the lists where it says it details the things that were taken from Jerusalem during this time, the one thing that is not mentioned is the ark. So, goodness, wouldn't it be interesting to know exactly where it is? It has certainly been hidden all these years, though I will add that there are a number of documentaries that indicate that it is in Ethiopia, that it made its way with Jeremiah into Egypt and subsequently was taken up the Nile and hidden in Ethiopia. So there are all kinds of theories about what happened to it. But here, it's not listed in the articles that would potentially be taken from the temple. Interesting. Chapter 28, here we have the interplay of the false prophecy of Hananiah and Jeremiah. So Jeremiah in 27 is the yoke upon his shoulders. Well, here Hananiah in verses 10 through 11 are going to take that yoke from Jeremiah's neck and going to break it and claim, in fact, that in 2 years or less, the yoke of Babylon would be broken. So very, very interesting that you have this interplay between Jeremiah, who is proven to be the true prophet, and Hananiah, who is proven to be the false prophet. And you have this display that's occurring. And there are some who think that chapter 52 in the book of Jeremiah are, in the text that's found there in many ways is kind of capping off or culminating the fact that Jeremiah is the true prophet compared to those who were false. So in verses 12 through 17, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah to take the message to him that the wooden yoke would be replaced by an iron yoke, and that Hananiah, who was leading the people to trust in falsehood, would in fact die as a result of being a false prophet. And the text tells us at the very end of that passage that's exactly what happened, that Hananiah died that year in the 7th month. Chapter 29, and we come to the end, and there's 2 slides here that will bring us to the conclusion of this major section of the book of Jeremiah. And in 29, we find what's typically described as the letter to the exiles. And I think we probably need to acknowledge that we have somewhat of 2 letters that are in play here. The first, of course, is the letter to the exiles, and the second is a letter that is from Shemaiah, read by Zephaniah in Jeremiah's presence in Jerusalem. So let's look at the first of these letters, if indeed there are 2 letters. There may be some who would say it's just 1, some say 2, but in my understanding, I think we have 2. The first of these 2 is in fact the letter to the exiles. This letter He's going to anticipate the new covenant passages in the next section. This letter took place after the deportation of 597, but did seem to anticipate the latter deportation in 587-86. Verses 4 through 23 detail the following. The letter that Jeremiah has sent, and by the way, there are emissaries that are taking the word from Zedekiah to Nebuchadnezzar, and accompanying these two emissaries is the letter that Jeremiah has written to, in fact, the exiles in Babylon. And it's likely, I think Longman was the one who mentioned this, that these emissaries of Zedekiah had some sympathy for the message of Jeremiah, and so they may have taken that letter with them. Maybe Zedekiah was not even aware that this was the case, though likely would have certainly heard later that would have occurred. But the letter includes the following things: to tell the exiles that they are to settle down and settle in. They're to build houses. They're to plant gardens. They're to have families. They are to multiply rather than decrease. They are to pursue the well-being of the city in which they live. Don't let the false prophets fool you further, because there will come a time when 70 years has passed, that the Lord will fulfill his promise and return his people. The Lord knows the plans he has for them. It is plans for well-being, for future, and hope. And the people will call and pray, and the Lord will listen. The Lord will restore, and he will deal with the false prophets, among them being Ahab and Zedekiah. This is not King Zedekiah. This is another Zedekiah who indicated here was likely a prophet himself. So this is what happens with the letter. The letter is basically saying that the exiles in Babylon are to settle down, settle in, live their lives well, prosper, and they will find eventually the opportunity to return. It is well known historically that while a number of people did eventually return after the 7 years from Babylon to Jerusalem and Judah, there was a strong and very significant population of Jewish people, families, who stayed in Babylon, and we know for hundreds of years yet to come, there was a strong enclave of Jewish people who remained in Babylon. In fact, so much so that even well into the time of Jesus, you have some sense of, not that Jesus acknowledges this himself, but into the time of Jesus and beyond, you have this strong sense of the Jewish demographic in Babylon that results in what's known as the Babylonian Talmud. So you have that strong Babylonian influence, Jewish influence, for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, there were two centers for Judaism after the Second Temple period. So remember that Second Temple period ends in AD 70. There were two centers for Judaism. One was in Babylon and the other was in Israel, in Palestine. Very, very important to recognize that. And then in the latter part of 29, we have this second, what I call a second letter, because this narrative in verses 24 through 32 are actually a little bit difficult to understand. They're somewhat puzzling, but if you read it as though it's a letter within a letter, then it becomes somewhat clear. And the key character here is Shemaiah. I've given you his name here. So it appears that Shemaiah, who is in Babylon, has instructed Zephaniah, who was the chief officer of the temple in Jerusalem, to deal, in fact, with the madmen prophets. And the madman prophet is Jeremiah in particular. This is ostensibly a reference to Jeremiah. And so Jeremiah has sent this letter to the exiles to settle down and settle in. But Shemaiah says, look, this is crazy. This madman is telling us to settle in, settle down, and to live here, to live well here. And so Shemaiah tells Zephaniah to put Jeremiah in stocks. And this was read actually in the presence of Jeremiah. That's told to us in verse 29. And so the Lord sends a message to Jeremiah concerning Shemaiah. And the message basically is this, that since Shemaiah prophesied a false word, he and his descendants will be punished. There will be none left remaining. None will ever see the good the Lord will bring to his people, which is the subject of what we will see in chapters 30 through 33 with the new covenant. And you will see historically played out with the return of the people beginning roughly 538 to 536 after the edict of Cyrus. That does happen. So this brings us to the end of this major section, and 29 is critical because it implies and anticipates what we see in chapter 30 and chapters 30 through 33 with the new covenant. And Jeremiah has said that the Lord will establish his people in Babylon. There will be a hope for them in the future, but that hope will be a restoration and a return to Jerusalem. We'll pick up those themes in the next chapters.